Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Meena Dayak, and I'm the Executive Vice President for Market Intelligence at Open Minds. I will be your moderator today. Um, as I've been talking with executives from health and human service provider organizations across the country in the last few days, I know that you are really struggling to manage through the pandemic, but I've also heard some common themes in the challenges that people are facing. Managing the transition to telehealth and virtual operations is a big one. And I also know that so many of you are struggling with a drop in revenue and cash flow issues. And you're thinking about what the new normal will look like when this is all over, because it is going to be over, right, one day. But we at Open Minds are here to help all of you through these turbulent times. We have just launched our new executive blueprint for crisis management. And through this program, we are providing web briefings like the one today, as well as on-demand resources and technical assistance to help you steer through the current crisis and also through whatever is coming next. So today, my colleague and Open Minds Senior Associate Ken Carr will be leading the fourth web briefing in our Blueprint series. Ken will be providing an overview of a really critical topic. He's going to talk about short-term cash management to assuring continued operations. So Ken has more than 30 years of experience in finance, technology, data analysis, and reporting in the health and human service field. He currently serves as a senior associate with the Open Minds consulting practice, and he has led numerous engagements in strategic planning, mergers and acquisitions prospecting, business process improvement, managed care and value-based contracting preparedness, as well as financial analysis of service lines and technology selection. So before I hand it over to Ken for his wisdom, a couple of housekeeping reminders for all of you. Your audio is going to be muted throughout today's web briefing, but we welcome your questions and comments throughout the session. Please just type them into the question box on the right of your screen and send them in to us. And I'll either interrupt Ken while he's presenting to ask the question, or we'll wait until he's done with his presentation. After Ken is done, he will be available for as long as it takes to answer all of your questions. That's what we're here for today. Ken's slide deck today and a full recording of today's briefing will also be available on the Open Minds website by tomorrow. So we'll make sure that you have a link to that as well. So thank you all for joining us today, and Ken, it's over to you.
Thank you for that introduction, Meena, and thank you to everyone for joining us. I know that these are difficult times, times of stress, times of a lot of work, and to even carve out an hour to look at cash flow and attend a webinar is a big commitment. So I thank you all for taking the time to do that, and hope that the tactics that we talked through today will be helpful as you move through this crisis and prepare for the challenges beyond. Today, we want to really focus on short-term cash management in a crisis type of situation. And so we're going to look at a number of tactics. We have about 7 tactics that we want to look at. Internal things you can do to manage your cash. And then we're going to also look at some things reaching outside of your organization as well. The goal of cash management during a crisis is really to accelerate and increase your cash flows, and to slow down and to decrease your cash outflows. And so it's a bit of a simple process. You just want to increase the cash coming in and decrease, or at least slow down, the cash going out. You know, as I was looking at cash flow and thinking in terms of this current crisis, I was reminded of something Jack Welch had said just about cash flow in general. He said, if I had to run a company on 3 measures, those measures would be customer satisfaction, employee satisfaction, and cash flow. And I think those are true whether we are in good times or in a crisis. Those are 3 measures that are really critical for us as we move forward. We need to continue to engage and hang on to those consumers that we're serving and serve them in the best way we can. pivot as we need to. We need to hang on to our talent. There may be some difficult decisions during the crisis that are required because of maintaining adequate cash and making it through the crisis. But all of that also is focused on our ability to really just make it through and have enough cash to get to the other side and positioned for what comes next. You know, as we look at some of the tactics, and some of these tactics we're going to talk about today, a number of those are based out of looking at what organizations have done in previous recessions. And we look back to the last big recession we had in 2008, there were a number of lessons learned. And in particular, I thought it was very interesting looking at Amazon, about 2002, 2003. They were an online bookseller exclusively. And just prior to the dot-com bubble, they sold a bunch of convertible bonds, brought a lot of cash in the organization. That positioned them during when the dot-com bubble burst and organizations were going out of business. They were different. They had cash, not just to survive that crisis situation, but to launch a new idea that they had called the Amazon Marketplace. And we all know where that moved Amazon. So, you know, having cash is really critical. In some organizations, if you are a provider that's positioned with a lot of cash right now, that's great. You're positioned to maybe lose a little less sleep at night, but you also want to maintain that cash because that's what's going to accelerate you as the new market variables really come about in the next few months. We also know that a number of organizations are struggling with cash right now. You know, information that we've got from California, from Illinois, and other provider associations indicate that you know, about a third of organizations have less than 30 days cash on hand. Compare that with a metric where we recommend typically 45 to 60 days of cash on hand. You know, about a third of organizations have no access to a line of credit. About a third of organizations rely on Medicaid for at least 80% of their agency budget. And so these are really challenging times for a number of organizations. And so when we look at cash in a crisis, we're really looking at a survival mode. How do we make it through the next few weeks so that we can restructure for profitability moving forward? So as we look at a number of tactics today, once again, we're going to ask a couple of questions. How can you be more efficient in how you use your cash that is used in your operations? We're going to look internally, and then we're also going to take time to look at how can you bring more cash into your organization. Before we get into looking at those tactics, though, I want to refer back to something Monica talked about on her webinar last week. And this is just the need to reforecast, to reset what our budgets and our forecasts look like now that we have a new reality. You know, for a number of organizations, not-for-profit organizations and for-profit organizations, you kind of put a budget together back before the beginning of the year, and you base that upon past utilization and what you thought you could do, and you built your budget, you took it to the board, and you put that budget into your accounting software, and that's going to be what you're looking at now for the next 12 months. But this is such an extreme crisis situation, this pandemic that we're facing. Those assumptions no longer exist. They no longer exist in reality. And so one of the very first things you do, and as you begin to look at a cash budget, and before you even do that, you need to reforecast where your utilization is going to be. What are you going to be able to do for the next 12 months? And to do that with multiple scenarios. I think it takes a good deal of flexibility in putting together our forecasts looking into the next 12 months, because we don't know how long in your particular state the curve is going to flatten out and things are going to get back to normal. We don't know how local businesses, how governments are going to be affected with their cash. And so building in multiple scenarios becomes very key. Looking at the detail, I think for the next 3 months in particular, particular because that is the most critical time, but then having a rolling forecast with some estimates that take you out through the end of the year. And once you've got that revenue in place, you need to then step down into understanding, taking a zero-based approach, understanding what your expenses are going to be based upon that new utilization that you're looking at, and to calculate your margins. And some folks may end up saying, you know, if we can break even for the year, that's what we're going to end up doing. And so once you have that revenue, you have some sense for what your expenses are, and you have that margin or that break even point, there's going to be a gap. And then you need to move back into that gap and identify, gosh, is there any more revenue generating capacity that I can apply here? Can I shift some services around? Can I bump up that revenue? And if not, how am I going to cut expenses? It involves addressing the overhead issue. Do I have more overhead than the new reality of revenue utilization supports? And how do I move that along? And then consider even outsourcing other non-core services, because your goal will be to be able to create a budget that with new metrics that drive your revenue, new expense drivers as well that you can make sure that you're aligned with, and you're going to need that to move along, and then implementing the metrics to drive that. That does a couple of things for you. One, it gives you a new reality, and it gives you an operating plan moving forward that will drive services and operations. But secondly, and we're going to talk later about reaching out and bringing more resources into the organization. If you're a small organization, you're reaching out to the SBA and applying for one of the PPP loans, or if you're working with your bank, you're going to need to be able to demonstrate where you're going moving into the future. And so this step is critical, not just to drive operations, but to engage funders, to engage banks and other resources in order to support you in this new scenario. So your ability to do a new budget forecast has to precede all other steps, and including these steps that we're going to talk about related to managing cash. So with that, let's just take a look at cash in particular. And as we think about internal sources of cash, you know, I'm reminded of the comment by George Soros that says it is much easier to put existing resources to better use than to develop resources where they do not exist. We all know how much work it takes to go out and get a new contract, to do a donor appeal, and all of those have a place, and even during a crisis, those have a place. But one of the first starting points for us is to look at our existing resources, our existing processes. Let's cut out things that we don't need. Let's do what we're doing more efficiently and better. So one of the first steps, one of the first tactics that I would like to take a look at is just managing cash aggressively. And when I think about managing cash aggressively, you know, 5 different things come to my mind. One is creating a cash budget. And we're going to take a look at the next slide of what a cash budget can look like. But you're going to need to manage cash in detail. Look at those cash inflows, those cash outflows, especially over the next 3 months in detail, and build that out for the next 12 months. Because if you see 4 months down the road that you're going to have a deficit in cash, or 3 months or 2 months, you need to figure out where that source is going to be. Are you going to pull that from current reserves? Are you going to be reaching out and getting a loan? All of those things can take time. And so you need that cash budget in order to identify what resources are needed, decide how you're going to pull those resources in, and allow sufficient time for that to happen. The next thing is really creating a cash flow management team. It's kind of a crisis team that you can put together. Managing cash in a crisis is not just the CFO's responsibility. It's not just the CEO's responsibility. It's a matter of finding all of the key stakeholders, frontline service managers, finance folks, the HR department, 80% for a number of providers. 80% of your expenses are related to staffing. So engaging HR staff as well, and helping everyone see the priority of cash management, helping everyone identify ways of cutting cash or speeding up cash, and then having shared metrics that everyone is educated on and monitoring on a daily basis becomes very important. It is the priority over the next 3 months or so to get you through this crisis time. The next, the point I would make would be to look inside the organization, and we're going to look at some tactics related to that. But once again, we're wanting to slow cash outflows. We're wanting to identify operating inefficiencies. There may be a number of things you've known have been inefficient for quite a while, but you've never taken the step to really deal with it for any number of reasons. Now is the time. This is the priority. This is a time of crisis. This is about survival and positioning that's going to impact you moving into the future. And then looking outside the organization, and I use the term aggressively, assertively pursuing cash. You know, this is such an unusual time. Any request should not be off the table. Your ability to reach out to banks, to look at government assistance, payers, donors, other funders, becomes very critical. And so any innovative idea that you can come up with or collaborate with other provider organizations to advocate for, it has to be on the table. You have to be in survival mode. And so aggressively, assertively pursuing outside sources becomes important. And then, you know, as with everything that has to do with our long-term survival, our ability to drive quality services, and our sustainability, having a focus on being data-driven becomes very important. And so you're going to need to monitor those cash balances on a daily basis. You're going to need to know what those metrics are. You're going to have a system to be pulling data from your EHR, from your accounting system, from your HRS system, putting that all together in a dashboard, using business intelligence. All of those sources for getting data to people have to be employed to be managing cash during this crisis time. You know, when we talk about creating a cash budget, it's a little different than the typical revenue and expense budget that we often look at. You know, with revenue budget, we're looking at accrued revenue. If we earned it, whether we receive it or not, we're recognizing that as a positive in our P&L. And likewise, you know, we're often looking at expenses that are non-cash, like depreciation on life. So a cash flow budget really takes a look at the actual cash coming in the door. This is an example in front of you of a cash budget for a provider organization. This provider organization has looked at their billing, and they've identified that when they send out bills in a month, they usually get paid about 75 of those bills within 30 days, and another 15% within 60 days, and about 8% takes them about 90 days. And if you add all of that up, they're about at a 98% collection rate, which isn't too bad. If you can be up around 98%, you know you're collecting quite a bit of that cash. And so they've used those percentages to look at their actual billed charges in January, February, and March in order to project how much cash they think they're going to be bringing in during April, May, and June. And then they've used their staffing expenses. And for this example, and quite often we think of our staffing expenses as a fixed cost because it is so costly to furlough and lay off staff. And so for this initial view, you know, staffing expenses have stayed as a bit of a fixed cost. Supplies and some of the other expenses are variable, and occupancy is a fixed cost as well. And so you kind of look at those cash outflows, you compare those to your cash inflows. And then in the bottom, this is really where the important part of a cash flow budget comes into play. You look at your beginning cash, beginning at each month, what the ending cash would be based upon these projections. What is the target balance you need to have in the bank every day just to make sure you can cover the next day's expenses? And then you identify what kind of a cash surplus or deficit are we going to have. And so backing into that, the next step would be, gosh, if I have a deficit in May of $36,000, what are my sources for that going to be? Am I going to pull that from a surplus? That's in May. This is April. Do I have enough time to apply for a PPP loan and have cash come in to cover that? So from here, you use that cash flow budget to identify and make sure you've got cash on hand. The other piece that this does is it helps you to look at some of those expenses. So if my cash flow expenses stay at 88,000, that's just not sustainable if I don't have the cash for that. And so it may also drive decisions related to reducing cash outflows. So managing cash aggressively, one of those key tools for doing that ends up being having a cash flow budget. The next area that I'd like to touch upon is an area that most providers spend a lot of time looking at, analyzing, working with, and it's really improving the speed of billing and collections. It's looking at your revenue cycle. And some organizations have spent a lot of time refining revenue cycle. We know there are 4 different processes related to revenue cycle. You know, referral and intake is really critical from the time someone calls and schedules an appointment, making sure that you are verifying their insurance and that it's up to date and it's correct and they know what their copay is going to be, getting any authorizations are needed. That is just that crucial first step. And then moving into service delivery, making sure that your providers have the right credentialing for each payer that a client is representing with. And credentialing can be one of the biggest areas of inefficiency. So making sure there are good processes around credentialing. Documentation. Documentation in particular can impact your ability to collect, but often the big challenge with documentation is it is delaying the ability of a bill to go out the door. And in a cash crisis, that becomes very important. Billing and collections, all about claim submission, working with denials, following up on those, posting and the remittances. And then in particular, that 4th area of monitoring process and process improvement, using your EHR, and there's all of this functionality in our EHRs that can help us do analytics to understand where we're falling down. So using analytics to identify areas where change needs to happen and implementing process improvement. In particular, I think as in a time of cash crunch, looking at certain things becomes very important. Making sure you've got those service authorizations. A number of you are pivoting very fast to telehealth. Do you have the right authorizations? Have you got everything in place? You may be providing services right now and think that those are going to be paid for, only to run into an issue that you find out in 30 days or 45 days that the claims aren't being paid. And so really making sure those authorizations are in place, there's clarity and all of that is in line becomes critical to getting that cash as soon as possible. Increasing the number and percentage of services authorized. This really has to do with both streamlining documentation, making sure that providers are well trained and that there's accountability. And I think even with those providers where accountability for getting documentation done in a timely way, even though it's been difficult to work with them in the past, if they know that this is a sustainability issue, then there will be motivation to work to get that documentation in place. And there should be motivation. They should be motivated to be able to do that. Increasing the billing intervals, so sending bills out weekly. I would say, if possible, with some services, if you've got a really good process, authorizations are in place, verifications, staff are documenting those encounters are being signed off on right away, to be able to ship those out on a daily basis is going to improve your cash as well. And utilizing your technology, I know that EHR vendors are very willing at this point in time to work with providers to identify functionality you may not be using right now, to identify better process for speeding up that revenue, because they know how critical this is for you. Increasing billing accuracy, once again, getting back to the clinician training. And then really looking at consistent processes. Those of you that have more than one location, looking at what are the best practices, who's the best practice manager that you have in a particular location, and using those processes to build a best practice, consistent across all geographic locations. So for me, because so much of our revenue and as a result, potential cash is tied up in revenue cycle, to me, this is a starting point. Even the smallest changes and inefficiencies can be improving cash right away for folks. You know, the next internal thing I wanted to touch upon was aggressively managing unit costs. And I think that aggressively managing unit costs is important because our tendency in a crisis is to just slash costs. We don't have enough cash, let's just cut staff. Let's make sure that we aren't spending more than we should be. And making blanket decisions that are not informed and may not be as strategic as they should be. And so our ability to know, and on Open Minds, we've talked a lot with folks about helping them understand their unit costs. And this is a point in time where understanding your unit costs is very important. And so using your data to analyze your profitability, your break-even point, and then strategically reducing costs can have less pain for the organization than blanket strokes of just cutting. So, you know, some things around understanding your profitability, you know, calculating that break-even point. You know, and once you have that break-even point, understanding ideas for reducing the break-even point. And you can, you know, you can change that break-even point either by reducing your variable costs or by increasing your revenue a bit. And so there are some strategies, but it all starts with looking at a particular service line, understanding what that break-even point needs to be. You know, we often think when managing cash that, you know, fixed costs are really difficult to work with, and indeed they are. But there are options during a crisis for working with fixed costs. I know a number of providers are looking at those fixed costs. They're looking at leases. They're reaching out to particular vendors to delay some payments. So, you know, as you look at that unit cost, your ability to maybe not reduce that fixed cost, but to delay it will help with cash. And then looking at your variable costs as well and what that contributes on a per unit basis. As you look at reducing and managing unit costs, it's important to remember quality in this process. It's not all about costs, which brings to mind some of the work of David Garvin, you know, who talks about what quality indicators are important. They're quality indicators that are going to impact consumer choice. And so if you cut these out, or if you cut costs without considering quality, you could be harming your organization and your ability to be serving folks more than you are helping with sustainability in the organization. Some of those quality framework points are performance, making sure that you know what the performance standards are and you have metrics to measure them. Features, what features are payers and consumers wanting, and are you focusing on those? Are you adding a bunch of bells and whistles that no one really considered as important anymore, or the payers don't want to pay for? So what features are you including in a particular service? Sometimes we want to offer a Cadillac when the payer really just wants a reliable Chevy. And reliability, how reliable are your services at meeting the intended results of what you want to do in treatment? Conformance to established standards, evidence-based practices, durability. So, you know, what's the lifespan of the service that you are providing? Serviceability, and there in particular, we're talking about How fast can you deliver service? What's the courtesy level? What's your competence? How long do people need to wait for an appointment, for instance? And so serviceability becomes very important in our ability to draw in consumers, but also manage costs. It's a cost that we need to figure into that unit. Aesthetics, how does someone feel? How does the consumer feel about the service that we're providing? And then what's the perceived quality? When someone sees your brand, what do they think? Do they think quality? And what's your image? So all of those things have to come into play as we're looking at managing unit costs. You know, under this concept of just slashing costs versus in a very informed strategic way, identifying and eliminating those things that add cost but not value, one of the best tools that I think is around is the idea of activity-based costing. Activity-based costing, we'll look at a slide and dig into that in a little more detail in a minute, but it really involves looking at activities, specific steps in an activity, identifying who does it, assigning some costs. And once you have a list of activities as opposed to just a list of costs, you can begin to identify, boy, there's a problem with this activity. I think there's inefficiency there. Maybe this step could be removed completely. And so to be strategic in managing our unit costs, activity-based costing is this great tool, and we'll look at that in a little more detail in just a moment. Maximizing the use of investment in technology, once again, utilizing that EHR. You know, so many of us utilize just a few functions in our EHR, and there's all of this wealth of functionality that we could be using to create better efficiency, to communicate information better. Telehealth, are you utilizing telehealth? A number of people have pivoted to that, and there may be some refinement. I think telehealth moving forward will be a part of the established norm of how healthcare is delivered. So what does that mean for us, and how can we better utilize that, expanding our market, expanding our ability to serve consumers with quality, you know, functionality within the accounting system, HRIS and the like. So really maximizing technology becomes very important when we're looking at managing aggressively our unit costs. Considering outsourcing. So if we know the unit cost of a particular ancillary service that we're providing, then we should be able to compare that with what would it cost if I went out to the market to just buy that particular service. If it isn't core to what I'm doing, is there some way that I could go and buy it for less money than it takes me to build it or to provide it? And then really looking once again at overhead. And with overhead, you know, I have always found it helpful to look at relative benchmarks. And I say relative because I don't think we can allow benchmarks to drive everything. Or benchmark has to do with the size of an organization, whether an organization is growing, where an organization might be putting priorities. But using benchmarks can be helpful to assess the level of our overhead, and then determining the value added for each particular service, and confirming that the value that we originally intended for some overhead is still there. Let's just do a little deeper dive for a moment into this idea of activity-based costing. I think the concept can be lost on us unless we kind of look at a quick example. Once again, what we want to do is understand the cost of activities so that we can identify and eliminate inefficient and unnecessary costs. We talked a minute ago about breaking down activities into tasks and understanding who's performing tasks. And if I understand who performs the task and how long it takes them, I should be able to assign a cost. This task takes this person an hour every day to do, and we pay them $15 an hour plus benefits and taxes at another 30%, and we can assign the cost, and we know what that particular task is going to cost us. So, as an example, on the traditional side, if I need to make some fast cuts to sustain the organization over the next 2 months because I don't think I've got enough cash, my cash budget says I don't, and I've got a lot of labor as a fixed cost. I know labor is $600,000. That looks like the biggest area that I could make an impact. So I just across the board decide to cut 10% out of that. Well, that's just a slashing approach without strategy. But if I indeed say, gosh, in this particular department, these are all the activities that they do, and this is what it costs. And then I begin to drill down and say, gosh, reviewing encounters is almost half of the cost of that department. What could we do to use our technology to reduce the time it takes to review encounters? And how could we train clinicians to do encounters faster and more accurately? And if we did those things, perhaps we could cut that down. And so, really utilizing activity-based costing to understand where we can eliminate costs, either in a step that's not needed anymore, or in a particular area where there are inefficiencies, becomes important. So as we talk about inefficiency, I think that brings us to our next task or tactic, which is really streamlining operations. And there are a couple of ways we can streamline operations. One is a complete organizational restructuring. We do that often when we're building new strategy looking forward and we have to reposition for growth or new opportunity. But there may be a need to look at our organizational structure and pull that back based not just in the current crisis, but in the reality that the assumptions we built the next 12 to 18 months of operations on no longer exist. And so, one way of streamlining operations is really to look at organizational restructuring and identify perhaps layers that are no longer needed, maybe using more cross-functional teams, and really driving accountability to that front line. The other approach is just work redesign, which ties into what we were talking about related to activity-based costing. So, some steps there. Once again, I really think it's important to know your unit costs, to know what the benchmarks are. You're looking at things on a service line by service line basis. That's going to be important when you look at another tactic in a moment related to those potential service lines that maybe should be discontinued. So aggressively management your unit costs, looking once again at quality, activities, and then do some value engineering. And I know that we'll be having a webinar coming up as well down the line on just process improvement in particular. I'm a real advocate of lean accounting. Often in our accounting systems, we're tracking things in so much more detail than we need. Now in a crisis, we need to manage cash in great detail, but overall, there are a lot of processes we have in place that just waste time, or they take time and they put it into processing when we could be better using that resource to communicate data and advise operations. Projecting costs, once again, as you streamline those operations, ramping up using cash forecasts, and once again, the whole idea of metrics. Now, as we talk about managing unit costs and streamlining operations, I know a number of folks will say, but cash is really critical for me in the next 2 to 3 weeks. And so I would say some of these, we can take a long time. We can make this into a 6-month process of streamlining operations and doing activity-based costing, or we can talk to staff and we can identify those inefficiencies that are out there right now that everyone knows about. We've just really either not had the energy or the will to change, and to change it now. A crisis helps us to do those things sometimes that we've just delayed doing, but now they become critical for us. And often in this whole process, it's about identifying those things. Peter Drucker, for instance, said, don't tell me what you're doing, tell me what you've stopped doing. And there may be a number of things that could save cash right now if we identify them and stop doing them. Another internal tactic ends up being optimizing talent. A number of you have spent a tremendous amount of time in implementing HR management changes, implementing all kinds of safety protocols and working with employee travel protocols. How do you serve folks in the community, and how are you going to have enough masks to protect staff, moving to virtual work, and who can work at home, and what equipment is needed, and how staff are going to be supervised. So you put a lot of time into just kind of retooling. But as we look at costs and cash management, there are a couple of things I think are very important if we're going to be strategic about using our staff and making staffing decisions during a time of crisis. One is we need to look at revenue producing team members and impact, make sure that we maximize their impact on operations and cash. And there are a number of different ideas related to that. Perhaps you move to an incentive system so everyone understands how key sustainability is. You know, the folks are, I've heard that a number of folks are working with telehealth, and that the encounters are shorter now, which means they're getting reimbursed at a different CPT code that reimburses less money. And so working with staff to increase the number of folks, a lot more encounters that are shorter, perhaps tying that to incentive pay, but making sure that revenue producing staff are as productive as possible, that they understand why that's important, and having accountability about that is really key. And then we have our overhead staff, our non-revenue producing staff. There may be ways to redeploy them to bring more cash in, maybe bring those receivables, those old receivables down, and just work those receivables for 2 weeks because they're too high. And we have too many things that are over 60 days. So redeploying, using benchmarks. There may be a need to do some layoffs and furloughs. I think we do that in an engaged way, remembering that recruiting talent's very expensive for us, and we want to hold on to our really good talent, because when this crisis is over, we're going to need them to reposition the organization. And then maximizing technology as well to make all staff just more productive. We want to talk just a minute as well about this idea of continuing non-optimal service lines. A number of us may have service lines that we've known that really don't contribute to the bottom line, but we've always done them, and the community kind of expects it. So how do you make a decision about discontinuing a non-optimal service line, which you may need to do because it's just draining cash that you don't have? You know, one question you need to ask is, does the service have a positive contribution margin? And when I talk about contribution margin, so if you look at the revenue that it's bringing in and you look at the expenses, is there some contribution to all those other general overhead expenses? So that's one question you need to ask. And if you're going to reduce or eliminate a non-optimal service line, can any of the fixed costs directly associated be eliminated as well? I mean, if you were to stop doing something and yet you have a very high expensive lease that you're just going to have to hold on to, and you have no other use for that property, that will have to play in to your decision as well. Can the freed up revenue producing resources be used to increase service mix of a more profitable service? So, you know, if you'll stop doing this but did more of that, would you be able to see not just more revenue but an increase in your profit? Will eliminating the service have an adverse effect on more profitable services? Some things we do because they are supportive to our service array, and we may be losing some money. They may add to our reputation in such a significant way that we've decided we're going to keep them. And even though we're losing cash, they really play into our ability to provide this more profitable service. So that's one consideration. I always find it's helpful in working with organizations to look at a contribution matrix based upon both alignment with mission and profitability. So if I were to create a matrix of 4 squares, and on the x-axis I have alignment with mission, and the further out I go is more alignment with that mission. And then I have on the y-axis profitability, and the further I go up, the more money I'm making. Those services that align most with mission and profitability, we definitely want to keep those. And we may kind of question those that either are profitable but not aligned with mission, or unprofitable but are close to mission. But certainly those things that were a great idea, but they don't fit our mission so much, and we're losing money on those, certainly those are the things that we want to consider getting rid of. The other idea then is really looking at our services and understanding what's the growth potential moving forward, and how much am I investing in that organization. And a well-developed service that we've been doing quite a while, and people know us for it and bringing in a lot of cash, and we don't have to put a lot of expense into it, that's our cash cow, we're going to hold on to that. We might have some stars that have great growth potential, but we are investing money to grow that market. But we're going to hold on to it because those are our cash cows of the future. But then we have things that are kind of question marks. Maybe high growth rate, but we will never have a significant share of the market. Maybe a low market and low growth rate, and they're dogs, and we just need to divest of them. So taking a step back now, because you don't have don't have enough cash to support things that are not supporting your bottom line. And then I think really the other thought is dig into your financial metrics. It's so key going through the crisis, but as we retool organizations with new strategy for a new market in the coming months, understanding your financial metrics becomes important. I recommend doing a financial crisis management assessment, looking at comprehensively looking at your ratios, your current ratio, your debt ratio, your fundraising ratio, all of those things, looking at your policies, looking for efficiencies there, compliance, how compliant are you with those policies and procedures? How do you manage cash and working capital management, because that's going to be key in order to grow the organization, and how do you compare? And there's such data out there. You can be comparing yourself to other organizations and understand what's my competitive advantage based upon how I positioned myself financially. Implement a financial tool to identify and assess those key financial priorities, really looking at creating a tool that's going to educate and keep you on task, as well as update your board along the way. Modifying your management dashboard then becomes important as you're coming up with these new ratios. I think it's important to look at the balance sheet in particular. The current ratio is important. The quick ratio is important as well. But removing AR becomes really important in a crisis situation. You want to know how much cold, hard cash do you have, and so tracking that becomes important. Debt ratio, if you already have a high debt ratio, your ability to take on debt may be hampered. So having monitored that, it becomes very important. And then when we look at the income statement or the P&L, we're really looking at profitability by service line in dollars and percentages, and our revenue mix, and are we maximizing where we make the most revenue with what payers, looking at locations, and really creating best practices there. And then I threw in a slide, and for those who want to look at this afterward, just a definition of what I think are just some basic financial metrics that every organization should be looking at. I worked with an organization last year that really was had about $1 million of cash reserve on hand, that they wanted to take about half of it and put towards some leasehold improvements. And then as we looked at some of the days cash on hand, they had about 25 days cash on hand, and taking that cash and investing that in what they thought was the greatest need, which was expanding leased space, would have reduced them to just under 2 weeks of cash on hand. And so looking at ratios, understanding the impact can really drive better strategic decisions. So with my remaining time, and I have about 10 minutes, I just want to step through some of the external sources of cash as well. Reminded of what Warren Buffett said, as he was reflecting on the 2008 financial crisis. There's a fog of panic in a crisis. If you wait until you know everything, it's too late. And so I think as we are reaching outside of the organization, we need to do it immediately. If you haven't done some of these things already, you need to start doing them, I think, this afternoon, and preserve that cash balance that you have. The first thing is just to renegotiate payment terms with vendors, and I think you need to have a conversation with the vendor. Open, direct conversation is really important. You can't just unilaterally stop paying them. That never works, and it harms your relationship with a particular vendor. And so, having open, direct communication. And I know a number of providers that have already stepped out to do that and have been successful because everyone understands that these are mission critical times. And if you can make the case to a vendor to delay payment from, every 15 days to 45 days, or delay lease payments, that becomes very important. And realize that some vendors are better positioned than others. There may be some small businesses that you deal with, and cash is critical to them, and you won't be able to negotiate because it would put them out of business. But there are some other large organizations that you would be able to negotiate. And make sure, of course, as in all negotiation, that you are negotiating with the right person. And for those of you who haven't read the book Getting to Yes, it's a very critical strategy for being able to negotiate in a time like this. Consider negotiating different payment options. We talked about that. Maybe working with utilities. I know the local utilities in our area are really working with small businesses to make allowance. Be bold in your request, but be willing to settle lower, but get it out there. It never hurts to ask, especially in times like this where these decisions are mission critical. And then, centralize your payables decisions so that one person knows how much cash is coming in, how much is going out, and you really have that tight, aggressively managed process for payment of invoices. Reevaluate your customer contracts regarding payment terms. Reach out to payers, identify opportunities to speed up payments, maybe shortening the terms. Consider requesting advance payments, maybe alternate payment methods. Fee for service is not going to work if your utilization is down by 40%. So can you work with a payer to get money flowing to you on a grant basis or in another manner? So stepping out, and payers understand these are mission critical, and they need providers after this crisis to be delivering services. So, make those requests to payers. Advocate for short-term changes within your state. Perhaps, collaborate. I know the state of Illinois, the providers in Illinois are working together to really look at some waiver flexibilities. So reach out to your fellow providers and your associations to be advocating now immediately for some short-term relief in terms of cash flowing. And then consider proposing short-term contracts. And even if someone doesn't want to change things long-term, maybe they will implement with you a short-term contract. Request prepayment of services. So any way that you can get cash in a prepaid way. So cash in the door, making sure that your consumers are paying and understanding how important that is, that you are getting cash. Look at options related to the high deductible plans, maybe creating a cash payment schedule to speed up cash. Maybe someone can't pay everything at once, but if you can get them to agree to pay over the next 3 months at decreasing amounts, look at any way that you can arrange for that cash to be coming in. And then secure short-term additional financing. And I know that there's been a lot of discussion about this over the last couple of weeks, the ability to borrow short-term. As we saw earlier, a third of provider organizations don't have access to a line of credit. So, do what you can now. I think banks tend to be quite conservative, and so a bank may not be your best option now unless you've already built a strong relationship with a banker. To the extent that you have that relationship, I would keep it as strong as possible, because even a lot of the funding that we're seeing coming through some government programs is going to flow through banks. So your ability, even if you have cash on hand right now and you're saying, gosh, I have enough cash to carry me through this current crisis. You don't know how long the crisis is going to be. You don't know what cash you're going to need to reposition the organization. So if you have an opportunity to borrow cash short term or at a very low rate through the government, I would recommend that you look at all options to create the best cash position you can be in now.
Hey, Ken.
And yes.
Sorry to interrupt you. There's
Yeah.
a relevant question that I thought you might want to address as you're talking
Sure.
about this.
Yep.
The PPP, the Payroll Protection Program, seems to have run out already. People are having trouble actually collecting. Do you have suggestions for other short-term funding sources?
Well, and that is a major issue. I think our system has been overwhelmed. Stepping out to try to get the EIDL loan, and we'll look at that on the next slide, or the PPP. I would say, and I was advocating for organizations, as soon as this came out, to get in line, and I think that those organizations that moved right away were at least in line, and some of them have some approved loans kind of moving forward. I think that the government will come forward with new plans. I know, Congress is looking at how can we bring more money. I've heard the House talk about when they come back from recess, having more assistance for not-for-profit organizations. I think there'll be more government money coming, but that's down the road. And that's why I think our ability to look at other options to stem the flow of cash currently becomes very important. Let me just move to the next couple slides, and maybe we can double back to that as well, Mina. I think our ability, going back to that early on, the slide about reforecasting your revenue and projections becomes important as you're now approaching banks, either for a PPP loan or extending or increasing your line of credit. So having that plan in place can help you put together the criteria, the rationale you need to work with a banker and other sources. Seek professional assistance as well. This is really key, and I have, certainly working with your bank, your CPA. What I should have put on here as well is your attorney. As we think about those organizations that are over 500 employees, which has been kind of that cutoff we've talked a lot about with the small business PPP loan. I know that there are organizations with more than 500 employees who have been able to pursue options under the alternative size standard. And so, we see a lot of this data, and we've read through, of course, the CARES Act itself, but there are all these other small business administration requirements and rules that attorneys and others may be able to help you identify, the alternative size standard. I know of an organization over 500 employees that has been able to get approved for a PPP loan, even though they've got significantly more revenue. And the alternative size standard says that if your maximal tangible net worth is not more than $15 million, so your net worth, is less than 15 million, and your average net income after income taxes has averaged less than 5 million a year the last 2 years, then you meet some of the alternative size standard requirements. So, I think talking to a CPA, talking to an attorney who can help you maneuver through working with your banker, I would not stop and say, gosh, I'm over 500, I'll have to wait for the next opportunity to come along. I would work with an attorney to move that along. Implement a purchasing card to delay cash. If you're not using a P card system, to consolidate all your expenses and pay them through a purchasing card, which basically can delay your cash for another 30 days or so. This might be an opportunity if you can pursue that. And then certainly looking at donors. There may be some venture philanthropy out there, large pools of private funds. Angel donors, maybe doing some crowdfunding. So there are some options there. I think that is a challenge. Just to come back to your question now, Mina, it is a challenge that I think the government system is overwhelmed. I think Congress's intention for moving cash quickly has run up against the infrastructure challenges, even getting money into people's bank accounts through the IRS. It seems to be running into some challenges. In the meantime, I think we look at how do we slow our cash? Are there any other options? The CARES Act, they may be able to put more liquidity into that, and we may see that in 60 days. But what do you do now? And so I think you need to have that as an option on the table, but we need to have multiple options on that menu of how we're going to be getting cash. You can't account on it, I don't think, over the next 2 to 3 weeks. So you're really figuring out how else can I try to create liquidity. The last thing I want to touch on here, and I'm about out of time, is just identifying urgent collaborations. When Monica talked last week, she talked about this a little bit as well. And often we think of mergers, acquisitions, affiliations as, taking a long time and finding the right partner and going through that engagement and creating this really strong organization. And then there are times when, as Monica described it, we have our shotgun weddings. And because of need, we move forward fast. Now, that doesn't mean that we ignore what would make a good merger or an acquisition, but we do want to understand that we can shorten the process. There may be some organizations that will not survive through the next few months if they don't gain economic scale. And economic scale alone can't guarantee our success, but it brings in talent, it brings in resources to use better technology and position the organization in a better way for growth and sustainability. So once again, there are different options of considering private equity. Perhaps if you are a small intellectual and disabilities provider and you're privately owned, and there may be opportunity to continue your mission but join with a larger organization through it's being funded perhaps through some private equity. There are real estate investment trusts where you can sell an asset and then lease it back, and it gives you some cash immediately. And then of course we always think of the mergers. But the key is to identify the synergies. How are we better together than we were individually? How are we stronger together than we were individually? And how does that give us some economic scale? And I think in particular bring us talent and access to technology that positions us for the future. So the key considerations are the same with an urgent collaboration. You need some planning. You're just going to squeeze that down into a shorter time. It needs to be systematic. You need to be leveraging merger talent and probably more so than ever to make sure that this works out well and comes together on the time frame that you need. And then just some key merger questions. What are your strategic goals? And do those match those of your potential merger partner? What do you need to do to ensure success through your due diligence? And then what steps should you take to implement the merger? So we're about out of time for the presentation, but I do want to, for those who are able to stick around, answer any questions. Once again, cash, we want to maximize cash. We want to slow it down, slow down the outflows, decrease the outflows, increase the inflows. And the goal really is let's manage during the crisis, because we're going to need that cash following the crisis to retool the organization, new strategy for a new market. Mina, do we have other questions as well that have been asked?
Yes, Ken, we do. And thank you so much. That was very comprehensive. That was a great plan. We really appreciate you taking the time to walk us through it and for offering up so many strategies. One quick question that's come in is, if an organization has enough cash reserves to get them through, say, like the next 3 months, does it still make sense to pursue some of the short-term external sources like government loans that you just have to repay? Or if you feel like you have enough to get you through, should you just focus on what you're doing and not go after the loans?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think you can never have too much cash in a crisis. And even if you have enough cash, why utilize that cash? Because you're going to need that cash for repositioning in the future. So if there's opportunity, and this is such an extreme crisis that we have, that the government is taking steps to move cash, albeit that cash is moving slower than anticipated because of systemic issues at just getting it into the hands of organizations, still taking the opportunity to bring that cash in, to take on a loan with a 2% interest rate in order to leverage you to move into telehealth in the future, to reconfigure your services, to perhaps merge with another organization, have the cash to be able to do that and become a stronger organization after the crisis becomes very important. So I think moving forward with cash is very important, even if you've got cash in the bank right now.
Great, thanks, Ken. Another question, you talked about looking at what programs may need to be closed if they are not optimum, but how do you deal, if there are programs that executives feel are not bringing in money and want to close them down, but are facing resistance from the board and community to closing something down? Do you have suggestions for how to overcome those kinds of roadblocks?
Yeah, I think that's always the challenge with services that maybe have run their life, that they don't contribute quite as they used to, and they're taking more than their share of the profit or the organization. There are always champions of those organizations that really hold out for preserving that service line. I think using data, I think this is an extreme crisis, and for a number of organizations, we're in survival mode. And to go back once again to the new budget that shows if we do all of these cuts and if we take all of this work to reposition, best case scenario, we're going to break even. And so we don't have the luxury of holding on to things anymore that don't add to both mission and bottom line. So I think it's a unique opportunity that one might not have had even 6 months ago to be able to make the case and get buy-in because of the need for sustainability.
Ken, would the same apply if, this is another question, our board has also been, somebody's board has been very unreceptive to discussions of mergers and acquisitions. Would what you just said apply to that situation as well? How can you help the board see that it's a question of survival?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point as well. Often leadership teams see the need for a potential merger. They might have even identified a partner and they know this could really work, but they come into a situation where perhaps the board identity in the community, the board perhaps concerned about losing autonomy or control of services, they run up against that resistance. And even though the leadership team sees this as not just sustainable, but important for the future growth of the organization, they're not able to convince the board. And so I think once again, this creates a great opportunity, a crisis like this, to lay out how this is critical for sustainability. And where you might not have been able to make that case to the board in the past, now you lay out, this is how much cash we have in the bank, this is how we're positioned moving forward. If we don't make certain key decisions, we may not be in business a year from now. I think that argument, supported by data and good information, can help you to make the case.
Wow, well said, Ken. Thank you. So on the other hand, you also recommended working with payers and looking at your contracts and your rates. How can you get payers in a place where they're more willing to negotiate with you and look at your contracts?
Yeah, I think once again it's the same concept. I would do my homework, and we always talk about being able to make a pitch. I wouldn't create, when you go in and you're trying to get a new contract or negotiate for increased rates, often will take time, right, to understand the market and our specific positioning in the market and why, why we would be well positioned with a rate increase or by doing these new services, and we put our pitch deck together. I think it's a short-term pitch deck. I think it's going in to say, gosh, for sustainability purposes, you can see here's our utilization. If this continues, we'll be out of business in the next 3 months or 6 months. We're having to lay off staff. This is impacting your members. I would use data once again. I would put the pitch deck together to show them how this not only creates sustainability for you, a critical provider in their network, but also helps them fulfill their responsibilities to their members. So I think, once again, be assertive in identifying the potential solutions, advance us money. Let's do a short-term contract. Let's move away from fee-for-service, and you just pay us based upon budgeted occupancy that we had anticipated instead of actual utilization. Going forward with those ideas and supporting with data and a really strong pitch deck, I think making that case becomes very important.
Great. Thank you, Ken. And that brings us to the end of our questions today. Again, I want to thank you for the phenomenal job that you've done. I know that the recording from today's session will also be a valuable reference for people to hang on to. So as I mentioned before, we will make that available to everybody by the end of day today or early tomorrow. And if you have other questions that Open Minds can help with, please don't hesitate to email us, info@openminds.com. And our next web briefing is on April 23rd. That will be Tuesday of next week. We have another senior associate from Open Minds, Steve Remillard, who will be talking about everything telehealth and what it takes to move to virtual operations, one of the points that Ken brought up today. So we'll be looking at what telehealth was like before COVID-19, what it's like right now during the crisis, and what it might be like after, and how you prepare for it. So I hope you will join us. You can sign up again on our website, openminds.com, and we look forward to seeing you on Tuesday the 23rd, as well as throughout the series of web briefings. And if you think of questions for Ken after this, please do email us and we will make sure that we get you the answers. Thank you again, Ken. Thank you all for joining us today, and we'll see you soon. Take care.
Thank you.